All right. So, we've had a couple of weeks of break from our sermon series, but we are now in week 3 of Living in Exiles, Christians and the State. And in this series, what we're doing is we're exploring what it means to live as foreigners and exiles, which is what 1 Peter uses to describe Christians, the Christian church. So we are a separate nation, a holy people, a royal priesthood, foreigners and exiles, he calls us. And so that's the church is its own body politic, if you will. And so it's really tempting as we get close to the election to want to talk politics up here. And in a sense, I am doing that tonight, but I'm not going to be extolling you to vote a certain way on any candidate or position. I believe that as Christians, we constitute a kingdom, right, under God. And that is what our politic is. And part of learning what that means is learning what it means to live as foreigners and exiles. Rather than seeing ourselves as Americans and Christians, we are Christians who live as foreigners and exiles in America. And that doesn't mean we're not patriotic in any way, shape, or form, but that's part of what this series is about, is exploring what that means. And the way that we're doing that is by looking back to the first exiles, because when Peter says, live as foreigners and exiles, his readers, who were Jews, would have all had in mind, the foreigners and exiles when they were sent into exile, when Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, and all the Jews were taken out of Jerusalem, lived in Babylon and then in Persia for 70 years before they were allowed to go home. So these are the first foreigners and exiles, and I believe that they have lessons for us and how to relate to government, politics, the state, that doesn't get us wrapped up in this left-right dynamic, that doesn't force those two options as us, but this is a separate way, a way that God invites us to. And in the first 2 weeks of this series, we looked at Jeremiah, who was the prophet at the time, or a prophet at the time when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. And his message to the exiles in Babylon was that God has a plan. That very famous verse, Jeremiah 29:11, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. That plan is for the foreigners and exiles, and that plan is to bring them home. Essentially, we learn that it's okay, God's got it. Whatever's going on, sometimes the world of politics and the state and the government, it seems crazy, it seems wild, it seems like we have no control, no power. It's okay, God's got it. That's what Jeremiah teaches us. And so we have the ability to approach the world, to approach politics from a place of safety, security, not a place of fear. We don't have to be afraid of what's going to happen. We also looked at the book of Esther. And in Esther, we learned that we are ourselves part of that plan that God has. God has a plan, and it includes us. And that we might be put in positions and in places where God asks us to speak the truth and to speak out against injustice. The way that Esther did when she spoke up to the king about this plan to kill all the Jews that Haman had. So God has a plan. We can be part of that plan. That's what we've learned so far. Tonight, we're going to turn to the book of Daniel, and we'll be here for at least a couple of weeks, because Daniel really deals a lot with politics and the state. Daniel is literally, he's taken, when Babylon captures Jerusalem, he's taken as a kind of like a teenage boy probably, and he's drafted into government service. And we'll get into, I'll talk about a little bit more of the story as we read Daniel 1 together. But Daniel and his friends, who we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they sort of form the core of this story in Daniel, and they live in this tension, at odds with first the Babylonians, then the Persians, the government, the king or emperor, the government officials. And so there's a lot specifically in how to deal as foreigners and exiles with the government in this book of Daniel. So it's a really good place for us to go in this series that we're doing. So I'm going to read from Daniel chapter 1, starting with verses 1 through 7. We'll read a bit more of it later. If you have a Bible or a Bible app on your phone or whatever and you want to pull it out, now is the time to do so. But Daniel chapter 1 is where I'm going. Excuse the cough. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. So that's just verses 1 through 2, and it's just giving us background, right? That's just the quick summary of Jerusalem falling to Babylon. Here we go. Then, verse 3. The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new Babylonian names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. That's verses 1 through 7 of Daniel 1. So our book begins, as I said, with this quick recap. And then the Babylonians take some of those young nobles, right? Young members of the royal family, young noblemen, and he brings them and he's going to train them up in Babylonian ways. Basically, what's going to happen is he's going to indoctrinate them. This is standard practice in the age of empires. When you capture a place, right, what you want is the people you captured to become citizens of your kingdom. You don't want them sort of off thinking, I can't wait till I get to go home, or I don't want to be Babylonian, I want to stay Jewish. So you take these young noblemen or whoever, and you show them how good it can be to be Babylonian, and then the rest of the people sort of follow suit in time. They see their people living it up, and it's good to be Babylonian, and it's possible for us to acculturate and become like these other people. So that's what's going on here. These guys, these brilliant and handsome young men, they're going to learn what it means to be Babylonian. They're going to get to eat from the king's table, and after a few years, they're going to be in palace service, and it's going to help the rest of the Jews assimilate into Babylonian culture. So this is standard practice. And so we've got Daniel and his friends as part of this system. They're now taken in, and again, they probably know what's coming. They know that they're going to be living in close daily contact with the Babylonian government and the Babylonians. And really important note here that we're going to talk a lot more about is that all of these young men, and there's probably not just Jews. It's probably, because they went on a conquering tear. So it's probably, young men from Judah as well as from other nations that have been conquered at the same time. All those young men get a share of food and wine from the king's table. Now, to just about anybody in that day and age, that is an honor. And it's an honor because it's, the king's food, right? It's almost like sharing a meal with the king, even though he's probably not there when you get to eat it. But it's also, as you might expect, the best food. I mean, it's the best food, the best wine, good portions. There's plenty of it to go around. It's all prepared to perfection because it's the king's food. So this would be something that there's no reason to turn down as far as anybody can see. I mean, it's going to be great. But Daniel and his friends decide to reject this food, to turn it down. And there's a good reason for that. So I'm going to keep reading Daniel 1, 8 through 14. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who's assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. Now what's going on here? Why does Daniel think the king's food is going to defile him? In all likelihood, part of it is possibly that it doesn't, meet kosher, Jewish dietary laws. But in all likelihood, also, this food had been offered to idols before it had been brought to the king's table, which made it unclean. Anything that had been offered to an idol was entirely unclean. So even the stuff that Jews were allowed to eat would have still been off limits to them. So when Daniel's refusing to eat this food, it's not like a diet thing so much as it is refusing this defilement, this impurity of idol-sacrificed food. But as the Babylonian official points out, this is dangerous, right? It's dangerous because if Daniel winds up looking sick or weak, then both that official and probably Daniel as well could lose their heads. I mean, that's it. The king's like, "Hey, you're refusing my food." For both, if they look sick and weak, the king doesn't want them. And also, refusing the food from the king is implicitly refusing the king, right? It's saying this whole purpose of becoming Babylonian, we reject it, right? I remain Jewish. You won't turn me into a Babylonian. And so that defeats the entire purpose. Defeats the entire purpose of this exercise, of having them eat food from the king's table, of training them for 3 years. So they choose to remain pure and to remain separate by not partaking in this food. That'll defile them. And they don't want to accept this Babylonian culture. So, Daniel and the other Jews, they're having none of this. They reject that defilement. Daniel shows trust in God's plan, as we talked about. And he's sure that God's going to protect him, because if that's the will of God. And it works. The last two verses I'm going to read, Daniel 1, 15 and 16, says, "At the end of the 10 days, these 4 men looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead." So there's 2 ways to understand what happened there. And one of the sort of the classic ways to talk about it is that, Daniel's diet of vegetables and water is healthier than the king's food, and probably fatty food and lots of wine. And so he and his friends were just naturally healthier. And I think that's a distinct possibility. I don't want to discount that as being what happens here. But I personally lean towards the other reading of this, which is that this was miraculous intervention on God's part. For one thing, 10 days just isn't enough time to really make this, diet distinguishable. Not to mention, a diet of pure vegetables and water isn't necessarily healthier than what was on the king's table, because we don't know, whether it was terrible for you or good for you. But that's not my point. My point's not to get bogged down on what the meal was or what's, but it's to note that this was a risky thing that Daniel did. Daniel didn't have some health secret. This wasn't like the Daniel diet, right? In all likelihood, Daniel was at least a little bit unsure about how this experiment would turn out, except that he trusted God. He trusted that he was doing God's will, and so he did it. Daniel didn't know that his diet was actually better for him. So again, that's not the point of the sermon. We're not going to be here. We wouldn't be here talking about Daniel and his friends if the point of this lesson was to eat your veggies, which is a good point anyway, one that I could probably learn from as I'm sick tonight and don't eat my veggies enough. But we need to take this story and see how it applies now to our lives today, to our culture. None of us, at least not as far as I know, none of us are serving, an empire that conquered us and are being trained to become, people who assimilate to a new culture. But Daniel and his friends, they used purity as an act of resistance. They knew that in order to stay faithful to God, they needed to reject the fine wine and the food from the king's table. They needed to stay separate, to stay apart, which is what the word holy means. Holy means to be set apart for God. So Daniel rejects the genuinely good food that was from the king's table, because even if it was good, it wasn't good for Daniel. He and his friends practiced self-denial. They stuck to that plain diet of veggies and water, rather than giving in to the things in Babylon that were nice but were not from God. There is a part of our social and political world that resembles the situation of Daniel and his friends, even if it's not a direct analogy. And we find it in our sort of economy, our culture of consumption. Daniel and his friends, they were faced with a specific challenge. Everything in their circumstances pointed towards eating the food from the king's table. That food was better than plain water and vegetables. I mean, whether just by taste or by health, we don't know. There's more of it. There's plenty to go around, right? It's not a scarcity issue. Everyone else was doing it. They could be seen as weird outsiders if they didn't do it. They could lose their heads if they didn't do it. The only thing that stopped them was knowing that it was the will of God to remain pure and not do it. In the same way, we live in a world of stuff where new phones, new gadgets, new products are offered to us literally every day. And a lot of those products are good. They're readily available, and there's sort of this expectation that we're going to buy a certain amount of them. It's natural to upgrade our devices every few years, constantly looking for the new car, a better car, finding another better place to live, all that stuff. But Daniel knew that it's only by rejecting the king's food that he could stay pure, and I think that's a similar lesson for us in consumer culture. Because in the midst of all this consumerism, it's easy to assume that there's not a lot of harm in it, or to just do it because it's expected. But the story of Daniel reminds us that purity and holiness invites us to a different kind of life. Living as exiles means critically examining the things that we buy and the way that we buy, our consumption culture. This doesn't mean that we can't buy anything nice. Doesn't mean that we should never get stuff for ourselves. But it does mean we need to carefully consider the way that our actions, our buying habits, reflect who we are and who we're meant to be. We are not inherently consumers. We are citizens of the kingdom of God. And one of the ways that we can reflect that truth is through our consuming habits, through the lives that we live. So for one thing, we need to reject the cultural assumption that human beings are primarily consumers. That is sort of an underlying lie that our culture will try to sell us. And so we should be looking for ways to reduce the amount of stuff that we use in our lives, the amount of new things we constantly get. All the gadgets and clothes and food and all the stuff that we buy, we need to ask ourselves, how much of it is necessary? How much of it is good? And the truth is likely quite a bit less of it than we buy. And this is preaching to myself as much as anybody else here. And we need to use what we do have for as long as possible and reject this idea of throwaway culture or planned obsolescence. When we treat things as disposable, we reject the value of God's creation. We reject that things that God has made have value. Learning to live simply and to be content with less is difficult work, but invites us into the same struggle as Daniel, the struggle of purity. And you've probably heard the phrase before, maybe, vote with your wallet. As Christians, I think we need to be pure with our wallet. Many of the things that our culture offers to us are genuinely good things. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I really like this iPhone. But the latest iPhone, whether it's a genuinely good product or not, it may not be good for us to buy it. Living as exiles means rejecting the things that might keep us from God, whatever that might be. We need to carefully examine the things that we buy, do our best to make ethical decisions when we buy things, right? Some of the people who've known me for a long time know that there's a phone out there called Fairphone which is like a pure ethical, fair trade phone, but it's only available in Europe, and I'm like dying for it to come to America, because when this phone finally dies, I would like to get a phone that I can feel ethically good about. But it's things like that, looking at the products that we buy and asking ourselves, is this an ethically good product? Is it right for me? Do I need it? All of these questions are part of what it means to examine our lives, to live pure lives that sort of reject this consumer culture that's just being like everybody else, right? Just like in Daniel's day, to reject the food from the king's table seems odd because everybody did it around them. Rejecting the idea of needing to consume, needing to buy, is, I think, the closest analogy we have today. So the story of Daniel shows us purity is a political and a social act. It's not just a personal act. Being pure for Daniel and his friends meant rejecting the good food from the king's table in order to avoid any kind of defilement, in order to avoid ignoring the will of God or breaking the will of God. And so in our lives, we need to ask, what are the things that we need to reject in order to avoid defilement? What is it that the world around us would like us to partake in that we need to reject out of respect for God? I believe that Daniel's simple, pure diet reminds us to live simply, to avoid the defiling message of our culture that we're meant only to consume and to constantly get the next best thing. So let us then live as people of the kingdom of God, as foreigners and exiles who have everything that we need, because we have an abundant God full of grace who gives us more than we could possibly need. With that,